I was halfway through securing the last bolt on the wheelchair ramp when I heard the unmistakable clatter of high heels on pavement. I didn't even have to turn around. I already knew who it was. "Excuse me," came the sharp, nasal voice of Gloria Thompson, our HOA president and self-appointed ruler of the neighborhood. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" I wiped the sweat from my forehead and turned to face her. She stood at the edge of my driveway, arms crossed, her expression a mix of disbelief and irritation. Behind her, two of her ever-present minions, Carol and Diane, hovered like vultures waiting for a fresh kill. "I'm building a wheelchair ramp," I said, keeping my voice even. "My wife, Maria, just had surgery. She needs this to get in and out of the house safely." Gloria scoffed, as if I had just told her I was installing a roller coaster in my front yard. "That is absolutely unacceptable," she snapped. "This neighborhood has strict aesthetic guidelines. Ramps are not permitted unless pre-approved by the HOA board, and I certainly don't remember approving this eyesore." I tightened my grip on the wrench. "It's temporary," I said, trying to keep my patience. "Just until Maria recovers. And besides, this is my property." Gloria's lips curled into a condescending smile. "Your property is still part of the HOA, Mr. Sutton. And we have rules. You'll need to take this down immediately or face fines." Carol and Diane nodded in unison, like a pair of wind-up dolls. I took a deep breath. "You do realize that the Americans with Disabilities Act overrides any HOA guidelines, right?" Gloria's smile faltered for the briefest moment before she quickly recovered. "Oh, please," she said, waving a manicured hand. "That only applies to businesses. This is private property. The HOA has every right to enforce its regulations." I stared at her, barely believing what I was hearing. "So you're telling me that my wife, who can barely walk right now, has to struggle up the stairs because you don't like how a temporary ramp looks?" Gloria's eyes gleamed with something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. "I'm telling you that you need to follow the rules like everyone else. If that ramp isn't gone by the end of the week, you'll be fined $200 per day until it is." Carol and Diane exchanged smug glances, as if they had just witnessed some great victory. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm.
"Fine," I said.
"If you really want to go down this road, we can." Gloria arched an eyebrow. "Oh, and what exactly are you going to do?" I gave her a tight-lipped smile. "You'll see." She let out an exaggerated sigh. "Honestly, I don't know why you're being so difficult. Rules are rules. If we let you do this, then everyone will start making changes to their homes. We have to maintain order." I didn't bother responding. I just turned back to my ramp and resumed tightening the bolts while Gloria and her entourage strutted away, whispering to each other like high school bullies. As soon as they were out of earshot, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the one name I knew could handle this mess. Elliot Sutton, my son. And, conveniently enough, a federal civil rights lawyer. I hit dial. "Hey, Dad." Elliot answered almost immediately. "What's up?" I leaned against the railing of the ramp, watching Gloria disappear down the street. "You're gonna love this one," I said. "The HOA just told me I need to tear down the wheelchair ramp I built for your mother. Apparently, it ruins the aesthetic of the neighborhood." There was a pause. Then, Elliot let out a slow, deliberate chuckle. "Oh," he said, his voice laced with amusement. "They have no idea what they just stepped into, do they?" "Not a clue," I replied. "You got time to help me teach them a lesson?" Elliot didn't even hesitate. "Absolutely." Elliot arrived the next morning, dressed in business casual and carrying a leather briefcase that I knew meant trouble for the HOA. He stepped out of his car, took one look at the wheelchair ramp, and shook his head in disbelief. "Unreal," he muttered. "They're really trying to pull this nonsense?" Maria sat on the porch, bundled in a blanket, watching as he approached. "You know Gloria," she said, her voice tired but amused. She'd rather bulldoze a hospital than let anyone defy her rules. Elliot let out a dry chuckle. Well, she picked the wrong family to mess with. He turned to me. All right, let's get to work. I assume you documented everything. I nodded and handed him my phone. Recorded the whole conversation. Time-stamped, too. He scrolled through the video, listening intently. His face remained neutral, but I could see the gears turning in his head. After a few minutes, he looked up. This is blatant discrimination, he said. They can try to argue aesthetics all they want, but the law is clear. Accessibility takes priority. Maria sighed. Gloria isn't going to back down easily. She thrives on control. Elliot gave her a reassuring glance. That's fine. We'll make sure this blows up in her face. First things first, I'm sending a formal complaint to the state's Fair Housing Authority. They take ADA violations very seriously. I watched as he pulled out his laptop and started typing at lightning speed. What's next? I asked. He didn't look up. We gather support. The HOA thrives on intimidation, but if enough residents push back, they'll cave. I need you to talk to the neighbors, see if anyone else has had issues with them. The more patterns of abuse we can document, the stronger our case. Maria perked up. Oh, I can answer that right now. The Johnsons got fined last year for installing a railing on their steps after Mrs. Johnson broke her hip. And the Petersons? Gloria tried to block them from putting in a ramp for their elderly father. They had to threaten a lawsuit before she backed off. Elliot's fingers flew across the keyboard. Perfect. I'll reach out to them. If we can show a history of discriminatory enforcement, it'll strengthen our case. I stood. I'll talk to the neighbors in person. Word spreads faster that way. Elliot nodded. Good. Meanwhile, I'll draft a cease and desist letter and send it to the HOA's legal counsel. They need to know we're serious. Maria smiled, a spark of mischief in her tired eyes. Oh, Gloria's going to hate this. The next few hours were a whirlwind. I visited the Johnsons first, and as soon as I mentioned the ramp situation, they were furious. Gloria acts like she owns this place, Mr. Johnson grumbled. Count us in. That woman needs to be put in her place. The Petersons were even more eager. She tried to bully us into compliance, Mrs. Peterson said. But we had a lawyer in the family, too. She backed off real quick when we threatened legal action. I'd love to see her squirm. By the time I made my way back home, I had a list of over a dozen residents who had their own horror stories about the HOA. Fines for minor infractions, arbitrary rule changes, even threats of liens on their homes. Elliot took one look at the list and grinned. This is gold, he said. We're not just dealing with one case of overreach. This is systemic abuse. If we present this right, we can dismantle their entire operation. That evening, Elliot drafted a letter addressed to the HOA board, laying out the legal violations and demanding an immediate retraction of their threat. He attached the testimonies we had gathered and made it clear that if they pursued this, they'd be facing a lawsuit. We slipped the letter into Gloria's mailbox just before sundown. The next morning, she was on my doorstep. Her usual smug confidence was gone, replaced with barely concealed irritation. She held the letter in one manicured hand, shaking it slightly as she spoke. This, she said, is completely unnecessary. Elliot, standing just behind me, crossed his arms. No. What's unnecessary is you trying to strong-arm my father into removing a legally protected accessibility structure. Gloria's nostrils flared. You think you can just... Elliot cut her off. Yes. We can. And we will. The law is very clear here, Miss Thompson. You are in violation of the Fair Housing Act, and if you don't rescind your demand immediately, we will take legal action. Gloria's face darkened. You're blowing this out of proportion. Elliot smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Tell that to the state investigators. Oh, by the way, a formal complaint has already been filed. Expect a visit soon. Gloria's jaw clenched. You think you're so clever. Elliot didn't even blink. No, I just know the law. For the first time since this ordeal started, Gloria looked genuinely uncertain.
Fine, she snapped.
Keep your ridiculous ramp, but don't think this is over. She turned on her heel and marched away, her posture stiff with frustration. Elliot watched her go, then turned to me. She'll try something else. People like her don't know how to quit. I nodded. Then we'll be ready. Maria chuckled from her chair. I almost feel sorry for her. Elliot smirked. I don't. Elliot was right. Gloria wasn't done. The very next morning, a white sedan with tinted windows rolled up to my driveway, and a man in a navy blue suit stepped out. He adjusted his tie, glanced at the clipboard in his hand, and made his way towards me. Mr. Sutton? He asked, his voice clipped and professional. I set down my coffee and nodded. That's me. Who's asking? He produced a business card and handed it over. Nathan Holloway, HOA compliance officer. I'm here regarding a formal complaint about an unapproved structure on your property. I took my time reading the card, even though I already knew what this was about. When I finally looked up, I let the silence drag just long enough to make him shift uncomfortably. I see, I said. And what exactly is the issue? Nathan cleared his throat and straightened his posture, as if rehearsing a script. It has come to our attention that you have constructed a ramp without prior HOA approval. As per our bylaws, all exterior modifications must be submitted for review before implementation. Failure to comply may result in fines or further action. I crossed my arms, keeping my expression neutral. Did Gloria send you? Nathan hesitated, then adjusted his tie again. I'm simply here to ensure compliance, Mr. Sutton. Elliot stepped out of the house then, dressed in the same business casual attire he'd worn the day before, his briefcase in one hand, a folder in the other. He sized up the compliance officer with a glance before stepping beside me. If you've been sent by the HOA, then I assume you've already read the legal complaint we filed, Elliot said. That includes the federal statutes that override your bylaws. Nathan's jaw tightened. I'm aware of the complaint, yes. Good, Elliot continued, flipping open his folder. Then you also know that under federal law, accessibility takes precedence over aesthetic concerns. Any attempt to penalize my father for installing a temporary medical necessity will be considered discriminatory enforcement. Nathan shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. I'm just following protocol. Elliot's eyes narrowed slightly. Then let me make it simple for you. If you or the HOA pursue this, we will escalate the matter to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And I assure you, they don't take kindly to HOAs that violate the Fair Housing Act. Nathan exhaled through his nose, clearly realizing he'd been sent into a losing battle. He glanced at his clipboard one last time before tucking it under his arm. I'll pass along your response, he said stiffly. Please do, Elliot said, his tone cool and measured. Nathan didn't say another word. He simply turned on his heel, got back into his car, and drove off. Maria, who had been watching from the porch, let out a quiet chuckle. They really don't know when to quit, do they? Elliot closed his folder with a quiet snap. No, but they will soon. By midday, the neighborhood was buzzing. Word had gotten out about the HOA's latest stunt, and neighbors started stopping by to voice their frustrations. Mrs. Johnson arrived first, shaking her head in disbelief. She sent a compliance officer? After everything? Gloria doesn't know how to lose, I said. But we're making sure she does. Mr. Peterson joined the conversation, arms crossed. Honestly, we should have fought back sooner. She's been pulling this nonsense for years. Elliot nodded, flipping through the growing stack of testimonies. That's exactly what we're going to do. The more people come forward, the stronger our case becomes. A few more residents arrived, each with their own stories. Fines for invisible weeds, threats over minor decorations, even attempts to block home renovations that were well within legal limits. Elliot took notes on everything, compiling a growing list of grievances. Then he made an announcement. "I'm drafting a letter to the State Attorney General's office," he said. "If we present this as a pattern of abuse rather than just an isolated incident, we can push for a full investigation into the HOA's practices." Murmurs of approval rippled through the small crowd. "And if that happens," Elliot continued, "the HOA could be forced to overhaul its leadership or even dissolve entirely." That got everyone's attention. "You're saying we could get rid of Gloria?" Mrs. Johnson asked, her eyes lighting up. "With enough pressure, yes," Elliot confirmed. "She's been running this HOA like her personal kingdom. But the moment it becomes a legal liability, the board will have no choice but to cut her loose." The mood shifted. What had started as quiet frustration turned into something more energized, more determined. "If you need signatures for a formal complaint, count me in," Mr. Peterson said. "Same here," Mrs. Johnson added. One by one, the neighbors pledged their support. Elliot smiled. "Then let's make sure they can't ignore us." The next morning, Elliot and I walked into the HOA's monthly board meeting unannounced. The moment we entered the conference room at the community center, Gloria's expression soured. She sat at the head of the table, flanked by the usual supporters, her lips pursed in clear irritation. "You're not on the agenda," she said sharply. Elliot set a thick folder on the table. "We don't need to be." The other board members exchanged uneasy glances as Elliot opened the folder and spread out several pages. "This," he said, "is a formal petition signed by over 30 residents, demanding an immediate review of the HOA's leadership and enforcement practices." Gloria scoffed. "You can't just storm in here and make demands." "You're right," Elliot said. "But the State Attorney General can." That got their attention. One of the board members, an older man with silver hair, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "What exactly are you accusing us of?" Elliot slid a document across the table. "Discriminatory enforcement, financial mismanagement, and multiple violations of the Fair Housing Act." Gloria's face paled slightly, but she recovered quickly. "This is absurd." Elliot met her gaze, unflinching. "Is it?" "Because we have documented evidence, recorded testimonies, and legal precedent backing every single claim." Silence settled over the room. Finally, the silver-haired board member cleared his throat. "And what do you expect us to do about this?" Elliot leaned forward slightly. "You have two choices. Either you address these violations, remove Gloria from her position, and implement fair enforcement policies." He let the silence hang for a moment before finishing. "Or the state will do it for you." Gloria shot up from her chair, her face red with anger. "You don't have the authority to dictate how this HOA is run." Elliot didn't so much as blink. "No, but the law does. And unless you want a full-scale investigation into the HOA's financial records, I suggest you think very carefully about your next move." The board members fidgeted, clearly uneasy. Gloria opened her mouth to argue, but for the first time, she seemed to realize she was outnumbered. The silver-haired man finally sighed. "We'll take this under review." Elliot nodded.
"Good.
"But make no mistake, if there's any retaliation against my parents or any other resident, we will escalate this immediately." Gloria looked like she wanted to scream, but she said nothing. Elliot gathered his papers, nodded at me, and turned to leave. As we walked out of the room, I didn't need to look back to know we had changed everything. Elliot and I stepped out of the boardroom, the heavy wooden doors closing behind us with a dull thud. The air outside the meeting hall was crisp, the late autumn breeze carrying the scent of dry leaves. The tension that had filled the boardroom clung to us like static, but as we walked toward the parking lot, there was a distinct shift in the atmosphere. Elliot tucked the folder under his arm, his eyes scanning the quiet streets of the neighborhood. There was no doubt Gloria was already scheming her next move, but for the first time, we had her backed into a corner. As we reached the sidewalk, Maria was waiting for us in the car, bundled up against the cold. She rolled down the window as we approached. Well? She asked, her tone light, but her eyes sharp with curiosity. Elliot leaned against the car door, exhaling slowly. They're rattled. Gloria tried to bluster her way through, but the rest of the board is shaken. They know this can't be ignored. Maria nodded, her fingers tapping lightly against the door frame. That woman has been ruling this place unchecked for too long. The moment she realizes she's losing control, she'll lash out. I rubbed my jaw, considering. We need to keep the pressure on. If we let up, she'll find a way to twist this back in her favor. Elliot glanced at his watch. I'll draft follow-ups for the Attorney General's office and the Fair Housing Authority. If she tries anything, we escalate immediately. Maria's lips curled slightly as she looked between us. I never thought I'd see the day when Gloria was actually scared. I leaned against the car, watching as a few neighbors walked by, whispering among themselves. The news was spreading. Gloria's reign wasn't as unshakable as she thought. That evening, our house became the unofficial headquarters for the growing resistance against the HOA's abuses. Neighbors trickled in throughout the night, some bringing old violation notices, others recounting their experiences. Elliot meticulously documented everything, creating a case stronger than steel. By midnight, we had a full dossier of grievances, financial inconsistencies, and outright discriminatory enforcement. Elliot sat at the dining table, flipping through the pages one last time before closing the folder with decisive finality. This is enough, he said, stretching his arms. We don't just have a case against Gloria. We have a case against the entire HOA's leadership. Maria, sitting nearby with a cup of tea, arched an eyebrow. So, what happens next? Elliot leaned back in his chair, considering. We send this to the HOA's legal counsel, formally notifying them that a lawsuit is imminent if they don't take corrective action. At the same time, I'll push for a public meeting where residents can voice their grievances directly. I crossed my arms, nodding. A public meeting would force them into the open. Gloria won't be able to manipulate things behind closed doors. Elliot tapped a finger against the table. Exactly. If we can get enough people riled up, they'll demand change. And if the board refuses, we take legal action. Either way, Gloria loses. Maria sipped her tea, her expression thoughtful. She's not going to take this quietly. Elliot's gaze darkened slightly. She can scream all she wants. The law isn't on her side. The next morning, a notice appeared on the HOA's official website, a mandatory emergency meeting scheduled for the following evening. The wording was vague, but it was clear they were scrambling to contain the situation. By the time the meeting rolled around, the community center was packed. More residents showed up than I'd ever seen at one of these gatherings. The usual air of quiet obedience was gone, replaced by a simmering dissatisfaction. People spoke in hushed tones, exchanging glances as they waited for the board to convene. Gloria sat at the head of the table, her expression carefully controlled, but the tightness around her mouth betrayed her frustration. The other board members looked uneasy, shifting in their seats as they scanned the crowd. Elliot and I took seats near the front, our presence impossible to ignore. The moment the meeting was called to order, Gloria's voice rang through the room, clipped and formal. We are here to discuss recent concerns raised by certain residents, she began, her gaze flickering toward us. Let me be clear, this HOA operates under established guidelines that are legally binding. Any accusations of misconduct are baseless and unfounded. A murmur of disagreement rippled through the room. Elliot remained still, his face unreadable. One of the board members, an older woman with short gray hair, cleared her throat. With all due respect, Gloria, the number of complaints we've received cannot be ignored. We need to address this properly. Gloria's jaw tensed. The board sets the rules. If residents have concerns, they should follow the appropriate channels. Elliot finally spoke, his voice even. The appropriate channels have failed. Repeatedly. All eyes turned to him. He slowly stood, pulling a document from his folder. "This," he said, holding it up, "is a legal demand for an independent audit of the HOA's finances and policies. It is backed by over 40 residents, multiple testimonies, and legal precedent." Gloria's face drained of color. Elliot continued, his tone calm but firm. "If the board refuses to comply, we will pursue legal action through state and federal channels. That includes a full-scale investigation into financial mismanagement and discriminatory enforcement." A heavy silence filled the room. Then someone from the back spoke up. "I second that demand." Another voice followed. "Me too." One by one, hands shot up around the room. The board members exchanged panicked glances. Even Gloria, for all her bravado, looked unsettled. The silver-haired board member finally spoke, his voice measured. Perhaps it would be in the best interest of the community to allow an independent review. Gloria turned to him, her expression livid. "You can't be serious." He met her glare with quiet resolve. "This isn't just about you, Gloria. It's about all of us. And frankly, I'd rather not have lawyers breathing down my neck." A slow ripple of agreement spread through the other board members. For the first time, Gloria looked genuinely cornered. Elliot folded his arms. "So, what's it going to be?" Gloria's hands clenched into fists, but she had no move left to play. The board members slowly turned toward her, waiting. Finally, with visible reluctance, she exhaled sharply. "Fine," she spat. "We'll allow the review." A wave of quiet triumph passed through the room. Elliot nodded once, as if he had expected nothing less. "Good choice." The meeting adjourned, and as people filtered out, the air was buzzing with quiet excitement. Gloria stalked past, her eyes burning with resentment. But she didn't say a word. As Elliot and I stepped outside, Maria joined us, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. Elliot stretched his arms, exhaling. "That was easier than I expected." I chuckled. "Gloria's house of cards is collapsing. She just doesn't know it yet." Maria smiled knowingly. "She'll know soon enough." And as we walked home, the weight of years of HOA tyranny finally began to lift. The following morning, the reality of the HOA's crumbling authority set in. The neighborhood was alive with hushed conversations and knowing glances. People who had spent years walking on eggshells around Gloria now exchanged quiet nods, a shared recognition that change was coming. By midday, Elliot was on the phone with a legal associate who specialized in HOA audits. The man was thorough, and after reviewing the documentation we had gathered, he confirmed what we already suspected: there were glaring irregularities in the HOA's financial records. Gloria had been bleeding the neighborhood dry through arbitrary fines and inflated maintenance fees. Several expenses listed in the budget had no corresponding receipts or invoices. Thousands of dollars had been funneled into vague administrative costs, with no explanation as to where the money actually went. Elliot's contact agreed to draft a request for a full forensic audit, which we would submit at the next board meeting. With the weight of legal precedent behind it, the board wouldn't have a choice but to comply. As we finalized the paperwork, Maria sat in the living room, scrolling through the HOA's online portal. She let out a quiet chuckle. When I asked what was so funny, she turned the screen toward me. Gloria had posted an update, a desperate attempt at damage control. The message was laced with passive-aggressive language about certain individuals causing unnecessary disruptions and unfounded accusations against the HOA. She framed herself as the victim, claiming that the integrity of our beloved community was under attack by those who refused to follow established guidelines. Elliot barely glanced up from the documents in front of him. He had seen tactics like this before: manipulation, an attempt to rally support by painting herself as the wronged party. But it was too late for that. The residents had already spoken, and they weren't buying her narrative anymore. As the afternoon stretched on, a few neighbors dropped by, eager for updates. The Petersons were particularly invested. "Mr. Peterson, a retired accountant, had volunteered to review the HOA's financials himself once the audit request was approved. His eyes gleamed with anticipation at the thought of poring over the numbers and exposing the discrepancies. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the house was buzzing with quiet energy. The momentum was undeniable. Gloria's grip on the neighborhood was slipping, and she knew it. But she wasn't done fighting. The next morning, I stepped outside to find a notice taped to my front door. The paper was thick, the HOA's official letterhead stamped at the top. It was a formal violation notice, citing unauthorized modifications and threatening daily fines if the wheelchair ramp wasn't removed immediately. It was a blatant act of retaliation. Elliot examined the notice, his expression unreadable. He flipped it over, checking for anything we might have missed. Then, with deliberate calm, he folded it in half and set it on the kitchen counter. Maria watched him carefully. She could see what I saw, the quiet calculation in his eyes, the way his fingers tapped against the table as he considered his next move. Gloria had just made a critical mistake. Elliot pulled out his laptop and began typing. He drafted an immediate response, citing legal statutes that protected accessibility modifications. He also included a formal cease and desist order, warning the HOA against retaliatory actions. Then he made a phone call. His voice was steady as he spoke, outlining the situation to a representative from the State Housing Authority. He detailed the ongoing investigation, the financial irregularities, and now, the documented retaliation against a legally protected accessibility feature. By the time he hung up, there was no doubt the state would be stepping in. Later that evening, a few board members arrived at my doorstep. They weren't with Gloria. In fact, the way they hesitated at the threshold told me they were here on their own. One of them, a middle-aged man named Richard, cleared his throat awkwardly. He wasn't one of Gloria's staunchest supporters, but he also hadn't openly opposed her before. He shifted uncomfortably before speaking. "Look," he said, glancing at Elliot. "We didn't approve that violation notice. That was all Gloria." Elliot nodded slowly, waiting. Richard rubbed the back of his neck. "Some of us on the board, we didn't realize how deep this went. The financials, the complaints, she's been keeping a lot of things from us." Maria stepped forward, arms crossed. "And now that you know?" Richard exhaled. "We're not all on board with her anymore. There are enough of us to force a vote. If we push it, we can remove her as president." Elliot studied him for a moment before speaking. "If you're serious about that, we can work together. But understand this: removing Gloria isn't enough. The entire structure of the HOA needs to be reformed. Transparency, fair enforcement, and legal compliance." Richard nodded quickly. "Agreed. We just need to be careful. Gloria's backed into a corner, and she's not going to go quietly." That much was obvious. As the board members left, Elliot leaned against a counter, arms crossed. Maria watched him, waiting for his assessment. "She's losing control," he finally said. "And she knows it." The next morning, Gloria made her final, desperate move. A tow truck pulled up in front of my driveway. I stepped outside just in time to see the driver stepping out, clipboard in hand. Gloria stood beside him, arms crossed, her expression smug. She was trying to have my car towed. The driver hesitated when he saw me. Something about the situation didn't sit right with him. Gloria, however, wasn't about to back down. She pointed at my vehicle, barking something about abandoned property and unauthorized parking. It was nonsense, of course. My car was parked in my own driveway. Elliot stepped outside then, his presence shifting the energy immediately. He walked straight up to the driver, pulling out his phone. "Before you hook anything up," Elliot said, his voice calm, "you should know that this is private property. And if you proceed, you'll be liable for trespassing and unlawful seizure of property." The driver blinked, clearly thrown off. He glanced at Gloria, who was rapidly losing her composure. Elliot didn't stop there. He gestured toward the security camera mounted on the front of the house. "We have everything recorded," he continued. "This is an illegal action by the HOA, and I assure you, you don't want to be caught up in the legal consequences." The driver hesitated for only a moment before making his decision. He stepped back from the truck, muttered something about not getting involved in HOA drama, and climbed back into his vehicle. Gloria's face turned a deep shade of red. She spun toward Elliot, fury radiating off her in waves. But before she could launch into whatever tirade she had prepared, a car pulled up behind her. It was an official state vehicle. A man in a dark suit stepped out, clipboard in hand. He took one look at the scene before him and then turned to Gloria. "Miss Thompson," he said, his tone all business. Gloria stiffened. "I'm here regarding multiple complaints filed against the HOA," he continued. "We need to have a discussion. Now." For the first time, Gloria looked truly afraid. Elliot exhaled slowly, watching as the official led her away. Maria stepped beside him, a quiet satisfaction in her eyes. "Well," she said, "that took less time than I expected." Elliot smiled faintly. "She brought it on herself." And just like that, Gloria Thompson's reign over the neighborhood came to an end. The moment Gloria was led away by the state official, the neighborhood seemed to collectively exhale. People who had been too afraid to speak out before now stood at the edges of their driveways, watching the spectacle unfold. Some whispered to each other. Others shook their heads in quiet disbelief. The tow truck driver, clearly wanting no part of whatever mess he had almost been dragged into, hastily pulled away, leaving Gloria without her last petty act of revenge. The sight of her being escorted to the official's vehicle was the final nail in the coffin. Elliot stood beside me, arms crossed, studying the scene with quiet satisfaction. Maria had stepped out onto the porch, leaning against the railing, her expression unreadable. Gloria had spent years ruling this neighborhood through intimidation, bending the rules to fit her agenda while punishing anyone who dared challenge her. But now, with state intervention underway, she had finally lost control. Richard, the board member who had visited our house the night before, approached cautiously. His posture was tense, as if he wasn't sure whether to celebrate or brace for impact. He stopped a few feet away, glancing at Elliot before turning to me. His voice was quieter than usual.
"We should talk," he said.
Elliot gave a small nod, stepping aside so Richard and I could have a moment. The other board members hovered nearby, looking lost without Gloria at the helm. Richard exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked exhausted, as if the weight of everything had just come crashing down on him. "She was never supposed to have this much power," he admitted. "When she first became president, she was just supposed to enforce the rules fairly, keep things organized. But somewhere along the way, she started thinking she could do whatever she wanted." I listened without interrupting. Richard had been complicit, even if he hadn't been as aggressive as Gloria. He had let her rule unchecked for years, and now he was realizing just how much damage had been done. Elliot remained close, not saying anything, but I could tell he was absorbing every word. He was waiting for Richard to get to the point. Finally, Richard met my gaze. "We need to fix this," he said. "Not just getting rid of Gloria, but everything. The way this HOA operates, the way we handle complaints, the way we treat people. It has to change." I studied him for a moment before responding. "Are you willing to do what it takes?" Richard nodded. "We'll hold an emergency vote. The board will officially remove Gloria from her position. Then we'll bring in an independent auditor to go through the finances. If money was misused, we'll make sure it's accounted for." Elliot finally spoke, his voice measured. "And after that?" Richard hesitated, but then squared his shoulders. "We rewrite the bylaws. No more arbitrary fines, no more selective enforcement. Everything needs to be transparent." It was the answer Elliot had been waiting for. He nodded, his expression approving. "Then let's make it happen." Richard turned back to the other board members, gesturing for them to follow him. They murmured among themselves, some still hesitant, but none of them had the energy to fight back. Gloria was gone, and the fear she had instilled in them had vanished with her. As they walked away, Maria finally spoke. "Do you think they'll actually follow through?" she asked. Elliot considered for a moment before answering. "They don't have a choice.
The state is involved now.
If they try to cover anything up, it'll only make things worse for them." Maria nodded, satisfied. By the time the evening rolled around, the neighborhood was buzzing. People gathered in small groups, discussing what had happened. The once quiet tension that had hung over the community was gone, replaced by something else: hope. The ramp that had started all of this remained exactly where it was, untouched. The emergency vote was held the next day. Gloria was officially removed from her position as HOA president, and an interim leader was appointed until new elections could be held. Richard followed through on his promise. The audit began immediately, and within a week, the first irregularities were exposed. Thousands of dollars had been siphoned off into vague accounts, used for personal expenses that Gloria had disguised as community fees. When the full report was released, the neighborhood was furious. People who had blindly trusted the HOA now saw the truth. The fines, the arbitrary rule changes, the intimidation, it had all been a cover for financial exploitation. Gloria had disappeared from the neighborhood entirely. She avoided the public fallout, but legal action was already in motion. The state had enough evidence to pursue charges, and it was only a matter of time before she faced the consequences. With the HOA under new leadership, changes came swiftly. The most oppressive rules were abolished, residents were given more control over how the community was run, and transparency became the new standard. One evening, as Maria and I sat on the porch, Elliot joined us with a small smile. "It's over," he said. I nodded, watching as neighbors walked freely, no longer afraid of petty fines or sudden rule changes. Maria reached over, squeezing my hand. "And the neighborhood is better for it." Elliot leaned against the railing. "It could have gone differently. If people hadn't stood up, if we hadn't pushed back, she would have kept getting away with it." I smiled. "But we did stand up. And now, she's the one facing the consequences." For the first time in years, the neighborhood truly felt like home again.